Hello, everyone. Good evening, and thank you for joining the live. My name is Kalisha Letlo Perun. I'm an immigration lawyer located in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, and I'll be talking to you this evening about the two new announcements that were made by Immigration Canada. The first one is the visa-free travel via the electronic travel authorization that was recently for the countries that were recently added to the list. And I'll also be speaking to you about the new programs or the new occupations, targeted occupations that were added to the Express Entry program. So, the first thing I would like to state is that nothing that I say here in during this live is legal advice. If you do need legal advice on a specific matter, you can contact KYL Law Firm. Also, in asking questions, you're free to put your questions in the chat section. However, I do want to caution you against disclosing personal or confidential information on the chat. You can send a message to us directly via Facebook or via WhatsApp. So, first, I'll be talking about as I mentioned, the visa free travel to Canada. So, on the 6th of June, Canada announced that it added 13 countries to the list that those countries do not require a visa to travel to Canada. And those countries are Antigua, Argentina, Costa Rica, Morocco, Panama, Philippines, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Lucia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Thailand, Trinidad and Tobago, and I believe there's also Uruguay on the list. Um, so those are the countries that were recently added to that exemption list. So what is a electronic travel authorization? So an electronic travel authorization is something that you need if you would like to travel to Canada by air. It is not the same as a visa. For persons who are not eligible for an electronic travel authorization, you will need to obtain a visa. What is good about the electronic travel authorization is that it takes way less time to complete and it costs way less than a visa. The processing time is far less. So if you are from one of those countries, you may be able to apply for an electronic travel authorization. To be eligible, one, you have to have a valid US visa. If you do not have a valid US visa, you must have had a Canadian visa within the last 10 years. So, 10 years from the date of your application, you must have had a Canadian visa. So, those are the two things that you require in order to be eligible for the electronic travel authorization if you are a national of one of those 13 countries. So, I will repeat it. It's one, you have a valid US visa. If you do not have a valid US visa, then you must have had a Canadian visa within the last 10 years. If you meet one of those conditions, then you'll be eligible for the electronic travel authorization. So, what's the difference between the electronic travel authorization and a temporary resident visa? The electronic travel authorization is processed within a matter of minutes. It's an application that you complete online. And once you submit that application and it's approved, you get the approval within minutes. It's sent to your email address. The other difference is that it costs much less than a temporary resident visa. The electronic travel authorization, the cost for it is only $7. So that fee is also paid online. Before you submit the application for the ETA, you have to pay the fee. So it means that you would need a credit card to complete the application. So the processing time is much less, the fee is less, and in addition to that, it's less requirements. Normally, when you're applying for a visitor visa, you have to submit documents to show that you have proof of funds, that you're able to fund your stay while in Canada. If you're coming to visit someone, you have to generally, you're advised to have a letter of invitation from that person. You have to show that you have sufficient ties to your home country before the application is actually approved. But with the electronic travel authorization, you do not have to provide those documents. The electronic travel authorization, as I mentioned, it is done online, and you're usually asked to provide your personal information. So that would include your passport details, your address, your contact information. And once that is done and you've paid the fee, then you generally get the electronic travel authorization. It's the approval is sent to your email. The electronic travel authorization is valid for 5 years. When it expires, of course, you will have to reapply for a new one. This application, however, it can only be used if you're traveling by air, and that is something that a lot of people miss. So, if, for example, you are in the United States and you're from one of the eligible countries and you want to come to Canada and you decide you'll come by car, you'll drive over the border, you cannot use your electronic travel authorization for that. So, it's only used if you're traveling to Canada by air. That is something that a lot of people miss. What happens if you're from one of those countries and you still have a valid visa? If you have a valid visa, it is best to travel on that visa, and then when the visa expires, you apply for the ETA, which is short for electronic travel authorization. So what can you do in Canada with an electronic travel authorization? Now, a lot of people assume that because now I can come to Canada without a visa, that I can study or I can work. That is not the case. The electronic travel authorization removes some of the barriers for you to come to Canada that were there if you needed a visa. However, you're still a temporary resident, and it therefore means that you cannot study in Canada and you cannot work in Canada. If you'd like to work or study in Canada, you still have to obtain a work permit or a study permit. So if you're able to come to Canada with an electronic travel authorization and you'd like to study, you'd have to leave the country and apply for your study permit from your country of origin. Having an electronic travel authorization does not allow you to study in Canada. It does not allow you to apply for a study permit within Canada. So when it comes to studying and working, the same rules apply. If you'd like to work in Canada, the general rule is that you would apply for your work permit from your country of origin. However, because of COVID, Canada did not meet its immigration targets and they've had quite a lot of labor shortages in different sectors. So there is a temporary policy that allows you to apply for a work permit from within Canada. So if you come to Canada as a visitor, let's say you come on with an electronic travel authorization, you are allowed temporarily to apply for a work permit. So I'll repeat what I just said. So generally, you'd have to apply for for a work permit from your country of origin. But because of COVID and the labor shortages that it created, there is a temporary policy that that allows a visitor in Canada to apply for a work permit. Now, in order to get a work permit, you would have to find an employer who is willing to obtain what is called a labor market impact assessment. So at KYL Law Firm, most persons usually contact us and they say, well, can you help us find a job? That is not something that we do. You need a job agency to assist you with that. So we do not assist you with finding a job or connecting you with an employer in Canada. we strictly process the immigration documents. So we're able to apply for study permits, we're able to do the ETA application, the visitor visa application, the work permit application. If you know an employer in Canada who's willing to hire you, and that person is willing to obtain the labor market impact assessment, we can process the labor market impact assessment for you. The labor market impact assessment is not processed by Immigration Canada, it's processed by a different government department. And once that application is approved, we then use that to support your application for a work permit. So just to repeat, if you come to Canada on an ETA, you're still a temporary resident. You're not allowed to study in Canada. You have to apply for your study permit from your country of origin, but you are allowed temporarily to apply for a work permit. How long can you stay in Canada if you come with an ETA? It's the same thing that applies to somebody who has to obtain a visitor visa. You're allowed to stay in Canada generally for 6 months. So when you land at the airport, if the officer stamps a date in your passport, it means that you have to leave Canada by that date. Most times they do not stamp the passport, so it means that you can stay in Canada for up to 6 months. If you want to extend your stay in Canada, you are allowed to apply for to extend that stay. So it doesn't mean that because the officer would have stamped, let's say, a date giving you just 3 months in the country, or your 6 months is running out, that you have to leave by that time. You can apply for an extension. So you would have to apply for something that is called a visitor record. When you're applying for that extension, of course, you'd have to show that you have a valid and a good reason why you want to extend your stay in Canada. So, for example, if you come to Canada, let's say you come to Canada with your children and you come during the summer school break, but then you want to extend your stay to, let's say, December. Now, an officer reviewing that application is going to wonder, why are you extending your stay along with your children to December when they'll have to be in school from September to December? So those are just some things you want to bear in mind when you're thinking about coming to Canada and staying in Canada or extending your stay in Canada. They will take those things into consideration. When you land in Canada, even if you're coming with a ETA, the officer still wants to be convinced that you'll stay in Canada temporarily. So I would advise people that if you're coming, let's say, for example, for a specific event, let's say it's a wedding or a graduation or a funeral, bring proof of that with you. The officer may not ask for it, but you never know what you may encounter when you land. You never know the officer who you'll meet with. So be as prepared as you can. So if you have proof of why you're coming, bring that with you. They don't ask, but sometimes they do. You might be the one person that they decide that they ask 10 questions to. So whatever proof you have with you have that can support why you're coming, you want to bring that with you. As it pertains to the electronic travel authorization, the application, sometimes we have people who are they you have your child on your passport. If you're coming with that child needs their own application. So for every person who's traveling, you have to submit your own application for an ETA. You cannot include the child in your application. And when you look at the questions in the application, there isn't any space there that allows you to add or include somebody in your application. So everyone in the family, even if the child is listed in your passport, needs their own application. When that application is tied to the passport, so when you get to the airport, they will scan it and they will be able to confirm that you have a valid electronic travel authorization. If you have any questions about the electronic travel authorization or any other questions pertaining to the topics I'm discussing tonight, please put it in the chat. I'll try to answer as much questions as I can. I may not be able to answer all the questions, but put it in the chat. And again, do not disclose any confidential information in the chat. If you have something that requires disclosing confidential information, please contact KYL Law Firm directly. Do not put this in the chat. It's not private and everybody will see it. So just to reiterate, the electronic travel authorization is valid for 5 years. In order to be eligible, you have to have either a valid US visa or you've had a Canadian visa within the last 10 years. The fee for the application is $7. You get your approval within minutes, and this application can only be done online. Everyone needs to do their own application. You cannot include somebody um, in your electronic travel authorization in the application online. If you have a visa that is expired, let's say if you have a visa the visa is in an old passport, you should travel to Canada with the old and also the new passport. If you apply for an electronic travel authorization and it's issued with a passport that's expired, you should travel with both passports with you, both the old and the new passport. If you're from one of the eligible countries, and I see that people are asking for the countries, it will be I'll paste it in the chat. If you are coming from one of those countries, you have to be traveling by air. So if you are traveling by any other means, you will have to obtain a visitor visa. You only can use the ETA if you travel by air, and I'm repeating that because it's something that a lot of people miss. Even though you may be eligible for ETA, a reminder is that you cannot study in Canada, you cannot work in Canada, you still have to obtain a work permit, and you still have to obtain a study permit. So the only thing that electronic travel authorization has removed, it's all of the steps that you had to go through if you needed a visitor visa. For example, again, like having to submit bank statements, having to submit a letter of invitation. You no longer need to show those things if you're eligible for ETA. You no longer need to show that you have sufficient ties to your home country, because normally with a visitor visa, you'd have to show that you either have assets in your home country or that you're currently employed, you have a good job. You don't have to show those things if you're applying for the electronic travel authorization. If you apply for a study permit, let's say you're from one of the eligible countries and you're interested in studying in Canada, you'd have to submit a study permit application. When your study permit application is approved, then you will automatically be issued with the electronic travel authorization. It's the same thing like a visa. When your study permit application is approved, then you will be issued with a visa. So you don't have to submit a separate application for the ETA and a separate application for the work permit or the study permit. If you're coming to work or study, you apply for your study permit or your work permit, whichever is relevant to you. Once that application is approved, they automatically grant you or give you a visa or an electronic travel authorization. And again, if you have any questions about the electronic travel authorization, please put it in the chat. If you have a valid visa, you travel on the visa until the visa expires. When the visa expires, then you apply for the ETA. And of course, that's a Canadian visa. So it has to be, if it's a US visa that is expiring and you've never had a Canadian visa, then when that US visa expires, you will need to apply for a visitor visa. You will not be eligible for the ETA. The exception with the expired visa, it's only if it's a Canadian visa. If it's an expired US visa, you're not eligible for the electronic travel authorization. So the list of countries that are eligible, which I've mentioned just a few minutes ago, is in the chat. If you check the chat, you'll see the list of countries who are eligible for the electronic travel authorization. I cannot tell you whether or not Canada will be adding more countries to this list. Sometimes they remove countries. For example, Costa Rica years ago did not, people from that country did not need a visa to enter Canada. At some point, that country was removed and a visa requirement was put in place, and now they've added them back to the list of countries who no longer needs a visa. So they may update the list. That is not something that has been disclosed. We don't know if or when other countries will be added to the list, but as soon as they do, an announcement will be made. And as I mentioned, sometimes countries who are on the list who are exempted from a visa are sometimes removed and a visa requirement is put in place. So the government has they have their own factors that they take into consideration when adding and removing countries to the list. If you're traveling to Canada, you're doing your application to for an ETA and you're not sure of the date that you'll travel, you just have to give an approximate date. I noticed someone is asking about accommodation and spending. As I mentioned earlier, you don't need to show these things if you're coming from a country who's eligible for the electronic travel authorization. If you're applying for a visa, you have to show, state, where you'll be staying and show that you have proof of funds. So that's the summary of the electronic travel authorization announcement that was made on the 6th of June. So what I'd like to move into discussing now is the occupations, targeted occupations who were added to the express entry list. So most of you would have probably heard the term express entry. It's one of the immigration programs that have been in place for many years. And we did a live on this back in 2021. I'll share the link to that live again that discuss in detail what the express entry program is. So the express entry program, it targets persons who are skilled to bring them to Canada to meet Canada's immigration needs. So, what Canada has recently announced is that they have a shortage of labor in certain sectors. So, they've now added a new category to the express entry program whereby they're targeting persons in certain occupations. So, there are 82 occupations who were added to the list that they're focusing on. So the express entry program generally has three categories. So the three categories under the express entry program is the Canadian experience class, the federal skilled worker class, and the federal trade skill class. So the federal skilled trades program, the federal skilled worker class and the Canadian experience class. So those are the three categories that are under the express entry program. So the express entry program is a points-based program and you get points for several factors. You get including your age, your work experience, your language skills, your adaptability, your education. So you're awarded points for these different things, and then you're added to a pool with thousands of other people who are in that pool. And whenever there's a draw that is done, if you have a certain number of scores, then you may be invited to apply for permanent residence. So under this new category that was added, as I've mentioned, 82 occupations are being targeted. So these occupations fall under five main categories. So they're targeting people who are proficient in French. So if you are proficient in in the French language, let's say French is your official language, then you stand a good chance of being invited to apply for permanent residence. If you are in if you have work experience in the healthcare sector, you stand a good chance of being invited for permanent residence. If you have work experience, sorry, in the area of science, technology, engineering, maths, or agriculture, or transportation, or a trades occupation, then you may be eligible under this new stream. So how does this program work? In order to be selected for that category, you must first meet the requirements of the overarching program. That's the Express Entry program. You have to meet the requirements of the Express Entry program. So it means that you have to create what is called an Express Entry profile. And when you're creating that profile and you're inputting your personal information, you'll see how much points you're being awarded for your age, for your education, for your work experience, for your language, for your adaptability to Canada. You'll be able to see that. If you do not if you don't get sufficient points, then you would not be able to create an Express Entry profile. If you get sufficient points, then you're able to create an Express Entry profile and you're added to the pool. So the first step is creating the Express Entry profile, which means that you have to have sufficient points to create that profile. In order to create the profile, you must take a language test. So oftentimes people would reach out to me and they would say, well, I'm interested in the Express Entry program, or I have work experience in this area. I want to come to Canada, and I would suggest to them the Express Entry program, but they've never taken the language test. You cannot create the Express Entry profile without taking the English test. That's mandatory. So you have to take the English test before you can even create the Express Entry profile. So where do you take the English test? There are two agencies that are approved by Immigration Canada to offer the language test. That's the first one is called CELPIP. The second one is called IELTS. It's IELTS. If you take a language test by any other agency, it will not be accepted and you will not be able to create a profile. So you have to use one of the two agencies who are approved by Immigration Canada to provide the test. In addition to that, you have to take the correct test, because usually these agencies offer two tests. They offer an English test for academics and they offer English tests for immigration. Sometimes people take the wrong test. If you take the test for academics, you will not be able to create your profile. The test for academics is, for example, if you're applying to a college or university in Canada, and they tell you, well, you need to take a language test, or your English language skills do not meet the requirements for admission, you have to take a test. So you have to ensure that when you're taking the test, you're taking the test for immigration, the language test for immigration. So the agencies that offer the tests, that will be sent out in another email to you. It's CELPIP and it's IELTS, IELTS. So you must take the test with one of those agencies. If you go on their website, you'll be able to find their location. Both of them are located in quite a lot of countries, and they're located in quite a lot of Caribbean countries. I know they have locations in Trinidad. I know they have locations in Venezuela, Suriname, quite a lot of the Caribbean countries. Unfortunately, there isn't a location in Guyana. So I would often encourage people, if they're able to travel to Trinidad or a neighboring country, they can travel to one of those countries and take the test. If they have a valid Canadian visa, and you're from a country like, for example, Guyana, that doesn't have a testing agency, then when you come to Canada, you can take the test. Writing an English test is not considered studying, so you do not need a study permit for that. So if you come to Canada, you have a valid visa, and you come to Canada, you can take the English test. So you have to take that test to create your profile. In addition to that, you must score above a certain number of points in the test. So taking the test alone is not it. You must get the minimum points that is needed. So if you write the English test, you will see that you're tested in four different areas. You're tested for your reading, you're tested for your speaking, you're tested for your writing, and listening. So you're tested for those four different things, and you must obtain the minimum score in those four areas. The test is all administered on a computer. It is only done in person. It is not offered online, and there is a fee for the test. It's just over $300, 300 Canadian dollars. So you have to pay for that test. What you do, you go on the agency's website, you book a date, you pay the test, and you have to write the test on that date. If you miss that date, you wouldn't get a refund. So sometimes people miss their date, you don't get a refund, you'll have to pay again to take that test. And it's only done in person, it is not done online. So let's say that you've written the test, and you've done well. You've gotten the minimum score in the four different areas. You can now move on to creating your express entry profile. So when you create your profile, based on the information that is entered in your profile, you will be assigned one of the three categories in the express entry stream. So you either be put in the category of the Canadian experience class, or if you're not in that category, you'll be put in the category of the federal skilled worker program, or the federal trades program. So you, based on what is entered in your profile, the system will automatically assign you to a category. So, what is the first category? I mentioned the Canadian Experience class. So, the Canadian Experience class applies to people who have at least 1 year work experience in Canada. So, for example, if you've come to Canada and you've studied in Canada, you are an international student, you completed your program, you got a postgraduate work permit, you were able to obtain work experience for at least 1 year in the last 3 years, then more than likely, once you've put in that, you've answered that yes, I have 1 year Canadian work experience, then you'll be put into the category for the Canadian experience class. If you're somebody who is living outside of Canada, or you're in Canada but you don't have Canadian work experience, you'll probably be put in the federal skilled worker program or the federal skilled trades program. The federal skilled worker program is, and it has to be within certain occupations, so, or certain positions, I would say. So how I would normally break this down is that I would say the federal skilled worker program is generally for jobs that require at least a certificate, or a college diploma, or a university degree. Jobs that generally require that would, if you would be eligible, for the federal skilled worker program. If you don't have that kind of work experience, you may still be eligible for the federal skilled trades program. And I often say the federal skilled trades program is for people who work with their hands. That's the easiest way I can explain it to people when I'm telling them the difference. So, for example, if you're a plumber, if you're a mechanic, if you are somebody, let's say you're a butcher, you'll more than likely go into the category for the federal trade skill program. So those are people who work with their hands, as opposed to somebody who's sitting in an office. Somebody who works in an office setting would more than likely be eligible for the federal skilled worker program. So the three categories are the Canadian experience class. That means you've had at least 1 year work experience in Canada. If you're not eligible for that, you may be eligible for the Federal Skilled Worker Program, which means that you've had at least 1 year work experience in the last 10 years in a job that generally requires a diploma or a degree. If you're not eligible for that second program, you may be eligible for the Federal Skilled Trades Program, and that also requires work experience because you do have to have at least 2 years work experience in the last 5 years. And that's mostly for people, as I mentioned, who work with their hands. So they're not necessarily in an office setting, but they're a mechanic, they're they're a chef, they're a butcher. Those are the kind of jobs that will be eligible for the Federal Skills Trades Program. So let's assume now that you've been able to create your profile and you've been put in one of these categories. You're in the pool with thousands of other people. So how does this recent announcement affect you? This announcement where the government says, well, we're short of people in these 82 different occupations. How does it affect you? So when you're in that pool, if you have experience in one of those occupations, then when they're doing their rounds of invitation, then you'll be invited to apply. So in order to get into that category specific wrong that the government is now doing, you must be able to show that you have work experience in one of those 82 occupations. And the good thing is that the government has actually reduced the work experience that is required for those occupations, those 82 occupations, and I will be sending those out, a list of them, in another email. So just to give you a an example of some of the occupations who are on the list. So for example, if you are in the health field, so they're looking for people, for example, chiropractors, dentists, massage therapists, nurse practitioners, optometrists, nursing coordinators and supervisors, medical radiation technologists, laboratory technologists, people who practice in natural healing, and people who have experience, for example, as paramedics, pharmacy technician assistants, physician assistants, midwives, psychotherapists, psychologists, respiratory therapists. Those are some of the examples of occupations that they're targeting in the healthcare sector. Vets are also on the list. They're also targeting people in the transportation sector. So, for example, if you're a truck driver, if you have work experience in water transport, if you have work experience in as a railway carman, if you have work experience working on aircraft assembly or inspecting aircraft, if you work in any kind of engineering that's associated with the transport sector, you may be eligible. They're also targeting people in the trade sector. So that would include most people who work with their hands. So, for example, plumbers, carpenters, electricians, welders, machine fitters, persons who have experience working as mechanics for elevators. They're also on the list. They're also targeting people in the agricultural sector. So butchers are included in the agricultural sector. And anybody who has any kind of supervisory work experience in the agriculture sector is also on the list. So I believe those are some of the five general areas. And as I mentioned earlier on in the live, people who are proficient in the French language. So if, for example, French is your first language, then there's a specific category that's available for those people, because Canada does have two official languages, English and French. And we do have two provinces, Quebec and New Brunswick, where French is an official language. So, for example, in Quebec, most of the population there speaks French. So there is a specific category who are targeting people who are proficient in the French language. Of course, you have to show proof that you have the experience. So even if it's the French language, there's a test that you have to take. There is a French language test that you have to take in order to show that you're proficient in French. If you're somebody who works in one of the occupations that they're targeting, you can't just say, well, oh, I have experience. You have to show, there must be proof. So what happens is that when you create your express entry profile, you'll be able to put your list your experience in that profile. When you're invited to apply for permanent residence, you will have to provide the proof. So I would often say to clients, ensure that the information that you're putting in your express entry profile is accurate, because you have to provide proof of that information when you're invited to apply. So if you say in your express entry profile that you are a mechanic, then if you're invited to apply for that, because you're a mechanic, you have to provide proof to immigration that you do have the qualifications, or you have the work experience in that field. So always, and we always try to ensure that the information we're including in our express entry profiles is accurate, and that you have proof. If you believe that you're eligible for one of these programs, I usually encourage my clients to start gathering their information as soon as possible. So if for example you've worked with somebody as a mechanic 2 years ago, and you've left that job, you've moved on somewhere else, then you'd want to reach out to that person and get a letter that confirmed that you worked there, the time that you worked there, what you were paid, so that you'll have that proof when you're ready to submit your application for permanent residence. Because when you are invited to apply for permanent residence, there is a time limit. You have 60 days to complete that application, which means that you have to have all your supporting documents uploaded to your online account within 60 days. If it's not uploaded to the account, then you will not be able to submit that permanent resident application. You have to go right back into the express entry pool. Another important thing that I want to mention is that the express entry pool is your express entry profile, sorry, is valid for 1 year. So if you create an express entry profile today, that profile remains active for 1 year from today. If you're not invited to apply within that 1 year period, your profile expires, and then you'd have to create a new profile. So if you're in the express entry pool, you'd want to keep track of the rounds of invitation. So the government, as I've mentioned, there is the General Express Entry Program. So they are doing invitations. They're doing them now, I believe, every 2 weeks. So they are doing invitations for the general program, which, as I mentioned, would include people in the three categories: the Canadian Experience Class, the Federal Skilled Worker Program, and the Federal Skilled Trades Program. So they're doing rounds of invitation for those. They're also doing rounds of invitations for those 82 occupations. So I believe yesterday they did do a round of invitation. They invited people to apply who are from those 82 different occupations. So that round of invitation was specifically targeted towards people in those occupations. So, one of the other important things to bear in mind also with this program is that your age is important, because oftentimes people get discouraged when they hear this. But I like to be honest and transparent with people and not just make people feel as though, well, there's this program and everybody can get in and everybody can get permanent residence. Your age is an important factor. The express entry program is ideally for people, I would say, below the age of 40. And specifically, you stand a better chance if you're like under 35. It doesn't mean it's impossible if you're older than 35 or if you're older than 40, because I've seen clients who've gotten permanent residents who are over 40 years. What it means is that the older you are, the less points you get for your age. So it means your overall points will be less than somebody else who, for example, is 25 years old, has a master's degree, has Canadian work experience. But it's not impossible for you. The good thing with the express entry program, especially for people who are older, let's say that you are 40 years old, is that there's another program, another subcategory called the provincial nominee program. So let's say you're 40 years old, you don't get any kind of points for your age, so you're thinking, well, I've lost a lot of points, compared to thousands of other people in the pool. I don't stand a good chance. You are able to apply to a province. So every province in Canada has its own provincial nominee program based on their needs. So you might, for example, be a teacher, and there's a province in Canada that has a need for teachers. So, what I advise my clients to do is that you do an application to that province, to their provincial nominee program, to see if they will invite you to apply. If you get a nomination from that province, which means that that province says, let's say your name is Stacy. Well, Stacy, we want to invite you to apply for permanent residence to live in this province, then you'll get points for that. What you do is that you now take that nomination and you go into the express entry pool and you add your points from your provincial nomination, which puts you way past other people in the pool, and more than likely now you'll be able to obtain permanent residence in Canada. So it's not impossible, but I still like to let people know upfront that your age is an important factor and you do want to bear that in mind when you're considering the express entry um, programs. So as I've mentioned, you in order to be to if you're in one of these occupations, you have work experience in one of these occupations, you have to meet the general express entry requirements, which means that you have to fit into one of the three categories. And then they look to see whether or not you have the experience in your specific field that they are looking for. Again, they you're given points for factors such as your age, your language ability, meaning that you have to take the language test. If you're proficient in French, I would also encourage you to take the French test because it means you'll get more points for having proficiency in two languages. So you get points for your age, your language ability, your education. If you look on the government website, it will tell you that education is not required for the Canadian Experience class, or it's not required for the Federal Skilled Trades program. That is somewhat misleading in the sense that if you have if you have a certificate or a degree, you get additional points. So, though it may not be required for a program, it doesn't mean that it's not important. If you have a certificate, if you have a diploma, if you have a degree, you get additional points for that. So, it may not be required, but it may determine whether or not you're invited to apply for permanent residence. So that is something to bear in mind. If you're applying, if for example, you're applying under the Canadian Experience class, you don't need to have a job offer. If you're applying as a federal skilled worker program, remember those are the people who generally work in an office setting, you don't need to have a job offer. However, you do need to have proof of funds. So if you're an individual who have work experience outside of Canada, and you're in the express entry pool, you have to show the government of Canada that you have sufficient funds to support yourself. What that means is that for one person, it's currently just around 13, I would round it off at $13,800. If you are married or you have children, you have to add more money for every person in your family. And for immigration purposes, your family only includes your spouse and your children. It does not include cousins and sisters. The immigration program is different from the program in the United States, but that is not a topic for today. So if you are a single person and you're coming in under the federal skilled worker program, You do need to show that you have proof of funds, which is just around, it's just 13,700, just over $700. So let's say 13,800. If you have children and a spouse, you have to add to that amount to show that you'll be able to support them. Now, the reasoning for that is because the government feels, well, you don't have Canadian work experience, so you may take a little bit of a time to find a job when you do land in Canada. So they want to ensure that you have funds to support yourself while you're searching for a job. If you're somebody in the Canadian experience class, you don't need to have a job because the government feels, well, you've already had Canadian work experience, so it would be easier for you to find a job. If you're applying, if you're coming in under the federal skilled trades program, a job offer is required. And again, remember, this program is for people who work often with their hands. So plumbers, electricians, mechanic, chefs, those are people who would come in under that category, and they are required to have a valid job offer. And the job offer must be a permanent job offer. It must be for at least 1 year. So it has to be a job offer for at least 1 year. If you have questions, I want to remind you again, please post your questions in the chat and I will try to answer as much questions as I can. So I see that someone is up. I'm there are two questions in the chat. I'm not, the questions are not clear. So Cam Williams, can you just retype your question for me? I don't understand the question. With regards to construction workers, as I mentioned earlier, there are the targeted, there are 82 occupations that the government is targeting, and they are included in a list that I will be sharing with via email. So if you've registered for the live, it means that we have your email address. If you haven't registered for the live, you can go back to the Facebook page. There is a registration form. You add your name, you fill out the form, we have your email address, and we will be sending that list out to you. So there are people in the trades sector that are being targeted for the express entry program. With regards to construction workers specifically, there is a separate program that is available in Ontario, but that is not something that I would be discussing tonight. But there is a separate program that is available in parts of Ontario that is targeting people in the construction field. So you may be eligible for permanent resident if you have the experience in that area. With regards to the question about scholarships and tuition, you'd have to speak directly to the school to find out that information. Generally, there's most of the postgraduate programs. So, for example, the if you're doing a master's degree, there are scholarships that are available, or sometimes you get funding via teaching assistantship, or a research assistantship. But you'll have to reach out directly to the school to look at the school to see what they have available. But I generally find that people who are doing postgraduate studies get funding in some form or the other. Um, so that's with regards to the question on funding. As it pertains to a study permit, as I mentioned earlier, the focus for tonight was the electronic travel authorization and the express entry program, and more specifically, the 82 occupations that they've added to the list. You have to apply for a study permit from your country of origin. You cannot apply for a study permit from within Canada. Even if you're eligible for an electronic travel authorization, you still need to submit an application for a study permit. If your application for the study permit is approved, then you will be automatically issued with an ETA or with a work permit. I hope that answers the question. As it pertains to students working in Canada, you are allowed to work for more than 20 hours. That is a temporary policy that will expire in December. But once that policy expires, it will go back to to normal, which means that you can only work 20 hours per week. But because of COVID, you are allowed to work more than 20 hours. If you are currently in Ontario and you are on a work permit, or you believe you're eligible for a postgraduate work permit, I would encourage you to reach out to us. I'm not sure what exactly the question is, Natalie Williams, with regards to the postgraduate work permit. You're asking whether you would be eligible for a provincial nominee program. That is not a question I can answer without doing an assessment. So, as I mentioned, these programs are targeted towards specific occupations. I don't know. I would have to know what your work experience is and how long you've had the work experience. And there's several other things I'll have to know in order to answer that question. You may be eligible or you may not be eligible for it. If you're eligible for a postgraduate work permit, that is a good thing. So it means that you'll be able to get work experience even if you're not eligible for the postgraduate, the provincial nominee program. If you have a job offer, then you'd have to ensure that the employer is willing to apply for a labor market impact assessment. So as I mentioned, having an ETA does not allow you to work in Canada. You still need to obtain the work permit. So if you have an ETA, you still need to apply for a work permit. Because of COVID, you can come to Canada as a visitor and you can apply for the work permit from within Canada. That is also a temporary policy, but you would want to ensure that the employer is willing to obtain what is called a labor market impact assessment. That is something that is separate from Immigration Canada. And um, that there is a fee that is associated with that. So you'd want to ensure that the employer is willing to apply for it and the employer is willing to pay the fee. There is a government fee that is charged for it. And also, if you're using a lawyer to do that application, there's also a legal fee that is charged for that work permit. So, again, to reiterate, even if you have an ETA, you cannot study in Canada or you cannot work in Canada. You must obtain the relevant work or study permit, even though you have the ETA. So our number is in the chat. It's 647-749-7472. You can either reach us directly, or if you're outside of Canada, I encourage people to contact us via WhatsApp. It's convenient and it's free. So if you're outside of Canada, contact us via WhatsApp. If you're in Canada, I encourage you to call us directly. You can, if you haven't registered for the live, I want to encourage you to complete the registration form. That way we have your email address on file. And whenever there are updates, we'd like to share those updates with you and keep you updated because you never know what program you may be eligible for. Again, if you have any questions about the electronic travel authorization or the express entry program, please post that in the chat. I am going to try to answer your question as it pertains to those two things. So there, someone is asking about a link for to check your eligibility for the express entry program. On the Government of Canada website, there is a link where you can put in some of your general information and it tells you whether or not you're eligible. That link is not always accurate. There is an assessment form that I use for people because it's a bit more detailed, because sometimes you put your information in the link, it tells you that you're eligible, but then when you come to me and I do a further assessment, you may not be eligible for the program. So while there is a link on the government website that you can check, it's not always accurate. As I've mentioned, if you have a Canadian visa, travel on that visa until it expires. And when the visa expires, then you can apply for your electronic travel authorization, because there is a problem with having sort of two temporary documents at the same time. So it's either you have an electronic travel authorization or you have a visa. So travel on your visa until it expires. So I am just trying to, there is a link as I mentioned. I'm going to paste the link in the chat for those of you who want to go to the government's website and check that link. As I've mentioned, it's not always accurate. If you need to get an accurate assessment done, we do provide that for you. So the link will be posted in the chat. The ETA is valid for 5 years. Electronic travel authorization is valid for 5 years. So when that 5 year period expires, you will have to reapply. So if you'd like to find out about the process of getting permanent residence, we've posted the phone number in the chat. You can reach us via WhatsApp. It's 647-749-7472. Contact us via WhatsApp if you're outside of Canada. It's difficult for me to answer such a general question because I don't know anything about you. I don't know your background. I don't know your work experience. So I wouldn't be able to say whether you're whether you'd be what program you're eligible for. If you are a nurse aide, that is one of the programs on the list. So for persons in the healthcare sector, that is a program on the list. So you may be eligible, providing again that you meet the requirements. And as I mentioned, you have to take the English test, because one of the issues that I have often is that people are interested in the program, but they've not taken the English test. So you have to take the English test first before you even create the express entry profile. So as I've mentioned, chiropractors, dentists, dietitians, nutritionists, nurse aides, massage therapists, those are all registered nurses. Those are all people on the list for the nursing, for the healthcare sector. If you're somebody that's in education, like an education counselor, you'd be eligible, general practitioners and physicians. If you're somebody who instructs people with disability, you'd also be eligible if you're a massage therapist, if you're a laboratory assistant or a technician, if you work in medical radiation, um, occupational therapists, optometrists, if you work in natural healing, if you work in occupations that do therapy and assessment, if you're a paramedic, if you're a psychologist, physiotherapist, those are people on the list. If you're a specialist in surgery, if you do counseling and therapy, those people are also on the list. If you're in the medical field, if you're somebody in agriculture and you have experience as a butcher, if you have experience as a supervisor in the agricultural field, if you have experience in landscaping, in ground maintenance, you'll be eligible. If you're somebody in the trade sector, you have experience as a carpenter, a plumber, electrician, welder. If you work on industry with industrial mechanics, You'll be eligible if you have experience in heating, refrigeration, air conditioning, elevator mechanic, or even residential installers and servicers. You may be eligible for the program. If you work in the transportation sector, I know there is a lot of people who are truck drivers. That is a popular one. You may be eligible. If you work in assembling aircraft or inspecting aircrafts, if you have any experience in the railway, or you're an engineer, you work in water transport, you may also be eligible for the category based program. So as I mentioned, these rounds of invitations are done every 2 weeks, and every week the government focuses on a different program. So one week they may issue a general invitation, the next week they may issue an invitation that's focused on people in the provincial nominee program only, the next week they may issue an invitation that is focused on people in the categories that they in those 82 occupations. And I believe the most recent round of invitation was yesterday, and there is a they've actually on July 6th they issued 1,500 invitations for people in the healthcare field. So people in the healthcare sector, they invited 1,500 persons, and the lowest points that you needed was 463 points. On the 5th of July, there was a round of invitation for people who work in like science and technology and math, and they issued 500 invitations. So 500 persons were invited to apply, and the lowest points you needed was 486 points. So they're issuing quite a lot of invitations now, so it is a good time to make use of the programs. Don't sit on it, don't delay, because oftentimes people, they take a long time, and these programs change very often because it's based on the labor needs of Canada. So if, for example, Canada decides that it's met its labor needs in the healthcare sector, that may eventually come off of the list. They've committed to focusing on these occupations for 2023. So we have 6 more months in 2023. Now is the best time to make use of it. We don't know what is going to happen in 2024 if it is that the government has done their research and they realize, well, we've met our labor shortage in this area, that those occupations are going to be removed from the list. So if you're in science and technology, let's say you're a civil engineer, you're a data specialist, you're somebody who's a computer developer, you have experience in web designing, you're a mathematician, you're a software developer, you may also be eligible for the program. So educators, engineers are on the list. Educators are on the list. If you're educator in the area of health, you may be eligible. As I mentioned, there's specific provincial nominee programs that target certain occupations, but that was not something that I intended to discuss tonight because that is a separate topic by itself. So educators are on the list for if you're in the health sector for this new category they've recently announced. If you're in the health sector, you may be eligible. Hospitality is not on the list, but you may be eligible for an hospitality program in a province. So you may be eligible for a provincial nominee program that for in a province that needs people in that industry. Landscaping is on the list, and that's for people in the agricultural sector. So it has to be specific, and that's why I mentioned if you need further assessment, the telephone number is in the chat, because what we have to do, we have to ensure that you match the actual requirements that the government has. So for every occupation, the government has a list of duties that you must have performed to show that you have the work experience. So we'd have to look at your resume and see the work that you did, because somebody may say, well, okay, I'm a landscaper, but then the work that you did as a landscaper before, doesn't match the duties that is on the government's website. So the government has a specific website that is dedicated to this, and every occupation, there's a list of duties that they have listed that they recognize. So we have to match what you've actually done with what is listed on the government's website to determine whether or not you're eligible. So the number is in the chat. It's 647-749-7472. You can reach us directly or you can reach us via WhatsApp, and in order to get an assessment done. So anything that's related to communicating, for example, communications and marketing, I see that on in the questions. If it's related, for example, to science and technology, you may be eligible. We'll send a list of occupations out in a subsequent email. So as I mentioned, if you didn't register for the live, please add your name. Please complete the registration form so that we'll have your email address and we'll be able to keep you informed um about the new programs and changes that are happening. So the name of the program is the Express Entry Program. I'm just trying to ensure that I read the questions in the chat. It is the Express Entry Program, and there isn't a this the program, the occupations that I'm talking about tonight, they come under the Express Entry Program. It's just called like a targeted category based programs. That's the general term that has been used for it by the government, but it's not a separate program. It comes under the Express Entry Program, and that is why I said that you first have to meet the requirements for the Express Entry Program in order to be eligible. Even if you work in one of these occupations, you must first meet the requirements of the Express Entry Program. Community workers are not on the list unless you work specifically with persons with disability. Community workers, unfortunately for now, are not on the list. But even if you are a community worker, you may be eligible for the General Express Entry Program. So it doesn't mean that you're not eligible for anything. As I mentioned at the beginning, I wanted to focus tonight on the electronic travel authorization and the specific new occupations that the government is targeting. So if you have work experience but you're not sure, contact us and we'll be able to tell you whether or not you're eligible. You still may be eligible for the general program. It just means that you're not eligible for this specific one. So the link for the registration form is in the chat. Complete the registration form. We'll have your email address on file. If you'd like to come to Canada, and you're not eligible for a electronic travel authorization, we can assist you with completing a visa application. You are allowed to travel to Canada for tourism purposes. That means you want to visit. But of course, again, there are certain things that you have that the officer looks for, and we'll be able to guide you through that. If we think that you have a good application, we let you know. If we think that your application will not be strong, we will let you know that. So if there are no other questions, we will bring the live to an end. If you have a question, I'll give it a few more minutes. Please put your question in the chat and I'll be more than happy to answer it. If you have an American visa and you're from one of the countries who are on the list, you need to apply for the ETA. So you cannot enter Canada with the American visa. You must have a ETA or you have a visitor visa. So it's one out of the two. If you have an American visa and you're national from one of the countries that are on the list, then you still need to apply for the ETA. You need an ETA. You don't need a visa. Is there a program that doesn't require an English exam? The answer to that question is no, unless you're being sponsored by a family member, and that means you're being sponsored by a spouse or you're being sponsored by a child. Um, if you're coming through the Express Entry program, which is the most popular program, you need to take the language test. The only exception to that is if you are being sponsored. And in Canada, you can only be sponsored by a child or a child, a child, sorry, or a spouse. Otherwise, the English exam is mandatory. How does age play a role? So, as I mentioned at the beginning of the live, you get points for several things: your age, your education, your language ability, your work experience, your adaptability to Canada. So, if you are 40 years and older, you will not get a lot of points for your age. If you're under 33 years old, you get more points for your age. The older you get, you lose points. So at 40, your age really, you really don't get points really for your age. So it sort of puts you at a disadvantage. But as I've mentioned, I've worked with clients who older and were able to get permanent residence because they were able to get into another program to boost their points. So that's how it works. The requirements for the ETA, as I've mentioned at the beginning, um, you have to be from a country who's eligible for an electronic travel authorization. The application is done online. You have to have a valid passport because the ETA is tied to your passport. You have to pay the application fee, which is $7. The application is processed within minutes and the approval is sent to your email address. It's a very simple process compared to having to apply for a visitor visa because you don't have to show proof of all the things that you would need if you're applying for a visa. So, if those are all the questions, I would like to thank everyone for joining the live. Please keep in touch. Please, again, fill out the form so we'll be able to stay in touch with you. We'll be able to keep you updated on the changes that are happening with Canadian immigration. And you may be eligible for one of the programs. If you want to find out if you're eligible or you'd like to do an assessment, you can reach us via WhatsApp. It's the fastest way to reach us. It's 647-749-7472. The number is in the chat, 647-749-7472. Contact us via WhatsApp if you're outside of Canada, and we'll be able to guide you more on that. And with regards to the person that is asking about their language exam and the West assessment, we'll be able to talk to you about that. You can contact us via WhatsApp, and we'll be able to see how we can work around with you in terms of your age. So thank you very much for joining the live. We will be keeping you updated via email. I do hope that you all have a wonderful weekend. Again, my name is Kalisha. I'm an immigration lawyer located practicing out of Toronto, Ontario. It was a pleasure speaking with you all tonight. Enjoy your weekend and look out for another upcoming live session. Thank you once again.